Joining us today is Steve Dekorte, who is the lead developer of voluntary.net, the creator and purveyor of Bitmarkets, and the author of the I/O programming language. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so voluntary.net has a number of projects under your umbrella. Let's start with Bitmarkets, though. It seems to be the one that's very interesting to a lot of people right now. Can you tell us what exactly Bitmarkets is?
Yeah, so Bitmarkets is an anonymous, decentralized marketplace based on the Bitcoin currency as the means of exchange. It's private. It uses Tor to protect the location of buyer and seller. It's built on top of Bitmessage, so messages are relayed without having to stay online or have persistent servers running. And yeah, it's basically to give people no fees, no middleman marketplace option.
So why was this feature important to you? I guess sort of why did you focus on the anonymity, and what ultimately motivated you to create Bitmarkets as it is?
Well, basically it was a political motivation and kind of a discomfort with the way that things were headed privacy-wise. It seems like at this point, like there are people that have been born not too long ago for which every economic transaction they engage in is being recorded in a way that, you know, could be shared or inspected or sold to advertisers or the highest bidder. That just didn't seem like an ideal future. And this was part of our way of giving people an option to that, potentially allowing them to do private exchanges and not have all that information exposed.
So with that said, what have been some of the most interesting use cases, or I should be a little more specific and say buyer-seller dynamics you've noticed developed on the platform?
Well, it's pretty new, and we don't really have much uptake yet. There's only been maybe a handful of users since we released it last November. And yeah, we're just a bunch of developers, 3 developers and 1 designer, and we put it together and released it, and got a little bit of good press, and didn't really think about marketing. We assumed that would have some, you know, take off on its own, and we're kind of finding that's not the way things work. So that's part of the reason I'm here, and kind of doing a tour of different Bitcoin meetups and talking about it. Yeah, I'm not really sure yet what the early users will be like or what they'll look like. We're interested to find out.
Well, let me ask you this, Steve. What do you hope that they look like?
Well, eventually, I think it's inevitable that all marketplaces are going to be decentralized, potentially anonymous, no fees, no middlemen. With the internet, there's just no reason to have centralized middlemen anymore. We can connect without them. It's kind of like Visa and MasterCard clearly aren't going to be needed when we have the internet and Bitcoin and those sorts of things. Why do we need Amazon or Craigslist or eBay? Why can't people just connect to each other? The big barrier has been sort of a decentralized messaging system, and we're slowly piecing together the parts to solve that problem. We're using Bitmessage to solve that problem. It's not ideal, but it's good enough for the scale that we need to do Craigslist and eBay-like uses.
So you mentioned kind of seeing a trend of decentralization and seeing like this as being kind of an inevitable culmination of a number of forces. Can you tell us a little bit about like how long have you been in tech, and what makes you see kind of in the course of your career, what makes you see this as being the right time for decentralized marketplaces?
So I guess I've been professionally in tech since the 90s as a software developer. Got into Next Step back in the day, right out of college, and I've kind of stuck along that line since then. I got interested in economics a few years before Bitcoin came out, and I was kind of primed to be really excited by it. And it just feels like all the pieces are coming together, as well as the economic components of some real serious problems in our not too distant future, pushing us towards alternatives and better solutions. The debt crisis, yeah, like all of these things seem like they're coming together. They're not quite there yet, right? We're just on the edge of all this stuff, sort of like in the late 90s with the internet. I remember seeing it in college and using email and seeing the first browsers and thinking, wow, this is, well, back then when I saw it, I said, this is clearly the future, but it will probably be the future our grandkids will see. And it turned out in 10 years, it was the future that there was a URL on every bottle of Coke. So now I'm kind of a little bit more optimistic about how quickly the future will arrive, and I've tried, with this to try to stay a little bit ahead of it, but it does seem inevitable.
Very, very cool. I have a question, again, about maybe what you said about 2 minutes ago, and it's regarding the marketing of the platform, as I'm someone who has been in marketing for decentralized platforms. What you said really did speak out to me, and I was curious what little things you may have missed when you were launching that maybe you look back on and you go, we should have done this, we should have changed this. Was there anything like that that you can identify and share with us, and maybe something if you had to do it over you'd change?
Yeah. I probably, like, when we first started working on it was at the beginning of 2014. And I think back then there really wasn't anything else around, certainly nothing that was working. And we sort of had the philosophy of not releasing vaporware, not announcing vaporware, just we're going to build it, we're going to make sure it works, and then we're going to release it. And I don't know if that was the best idea. Like what happened was other projects announced before they had anything working. And when we finally released in November, or even when we showed an early working version that summer at Bitcoin Amsterdam, everyone just said, oh, is this like Open Bazaar? So I kind of wish we had announced it when we started working on it. But I really don't know if that would have changed that or not. But that was one thing that maybe we would have done differently. As far as like other things, I think when we did release in November, the main public release, I kind of assumed that it would just take off on its own, that people would recognize that it was something valuable, something that could solve some problems that they have, and people would just start using it, and then media would come to us, and we did get a few good articles, and the UK Guardian did a full article on us. Reason covered us in an article about dark markets. But yeah, it didn't seem to happen organically. So I wish I had started reaching out and going to meetups and talking about it back then, which is what I'm doing now. And I'd be interested to hear your suggestions, maybe later in the talk or now, about what we could do to maybe help with adoption.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to talk with you after the show. Just hang out and we'll discuss it with you. But I'm going to shoot it back to Eric because I think that a question he really wanted to ask.
Sure. So now you're making the rounds in the media, and journalism is sort of starting to cover you up a little bit. But what is it that separates you from some of these other quote open markets or free markets? What is it that really makes is a differentiator for you guys?
Yeah, there are a couple differences. One is that we're focused on anonymity. I saw a recent interview about the Open Bazaar project, and they said specifically that that was not one of their goals. It really is one of ours. Another is that we're focused on sort of individuals interacting economically with individuals. So we don't require things like sellers to run persistent servers. That's a problem for anonymity, for privacy, and it's not really practical for your average person. So we're kind of focused on keeping this more like a Craigslist, eBay kind of thing, maybe a little bit less like an Amazon kind of thing. The other big difference is that we're using, maybe the biggest and most important difference is that we're based on two-party escrow. So the existing dark markets and existing centralized markets in general are all based on the idea that there's a trusted third party that sits between the buyer and the seller that allows them to transact in a way where they don't have to extend too much trust to the other party. And in traditional markets, that's worked okay. But in if you accept that there's certain fees and censorship and things like that that go along with them. But in anonymous marketplaces, there are real serious problems with having a trusted third party. All the exit scams have kind of shown some of these problems. The reputation systems or the reputation of the market are eventually things which can be exploited to steal money from people, to profit from fraud. And anonymous reputation systems are particularly vulnerable to being gamed because there's simple things you can do like proxying buys from a real seller to a real buyer in between a fake seller or a fake buyer, and then build up reputation just by an automated script, and then exploit that reputation to sign 2 of 3 transactions over to yourself for millions of dollars worth of transactions, right? I think that's just going to get worse. It's like a vulnerability that people are slowly taking advantage of, but it's going to happen more and more. And we offer this new system, this two-party escrow system, to solve this problem.
So you've said a lot there that I find really interesting. So I had a couple follow-up questions. First and foremost, do you think that the lack of focus on anonymity is something that they're being forced into to prevent sort of early crackdown or early pressure on them to, from centralized parties or authorities that are afraid of the enforcement of existing laws not being applicable anymore? And then secondarily, I'd like you to sort of describe what exactly and how a two-party escrow system works.
Okay, I'm not sure why their focus is not on anonymity. I can imagine those reasons being, very plausible, but I really don't know. To answer the question about two-party escrow, the idea is that the buyer and the seller enter into a 2 of 2 transaction where each holds a key, and the buyer puts up their payment as well as a deposit equal to the price of the payment, and the seller puts up a deposit equal to the price of the payment, and this gets locked into a 2 of 2 transaction. So once that's locked, the seller has an incentive to send the item in good faith because otherwise he could lose his deposit. Once the buyer receives the item, he has an incentive to release the payment, otherwise he loses his deposit. And if something goes wrong with the transaction, the seller can't send it or something like that, the buyer can request a refund, and if the seller accepts that, they can approve the refund, and the deposits can be returned, the buyer can get their payment back. So this system allows for everyone to see that their incentives are aligned with acting in good faith without the need for a trusted third party. And this is really important because you can't really, a trusted third party really has no way to fairly resolve a dispute in a system where there's anonymous identities that are only maybe have some reputation because all they have online is one guy's word against another. Like, who's telling the truth there? How do they know? They're not in the location that received the package. They weren't in the location that sent the package. They're not in between those two. Maybe that would be the best. If they were in between those two and could forward the package, that would be their best chance of having any idea who's telling the truth. But without that, they have nothing. All they can do is sort of be biased towards one party or the other, or sort of try to guess, who's the better liar. And that doesn't really seem like a very solid system. So this two-party escrow system avoids all that, and we think it should work fine. It makes it, at the very least, it should make fraud unprofitable, which I think is the most important thing for maintaining a healthy market.
So I'm very interested in this because it seems like you've actually raised the bar for the decentralization space. Not only have you removed trusted third parties, you've removed trusted parties altogether by having this anonymous escrow system, and it's really cool. I mean, like, escrow is one of the nerdy things about like Bitcoin technology, I guess, like the multi-signature escrow, which kind of gets me excited. It's really cool. And that was sort of going to be one of my questions, was sort of how you establish trust in this system, but it seems like that really kind of addresses it quite well. One of my questions for you, I guess, would be, how do you sort of view yourself in the decentralization space? Because right now, I guess, especially among blockchain technology projects, we see a lot of projects moving very strongly toward identity systems on the blockchain, where identities not only public, but also kind of unforgeable, and it's very hard to make fake identities, or at least potentially would be if some of these projects have their way. How do you feel about that? And do you feel sort of like maybe that technology is heading in the wrong direction? Do you fear that? And do you see something like Bitmarkets as an alternative to identity systems based on the blockchain?
I think identity systems are going to be necessary for certain classes of applications. Like if you're going to do ride sharing, right, or if you're going to have somebody take care of your kids, there's certain services that involve direct physical contact where coercion is possible. So you could get in a ride and somebody says, okay, you want to get to where you're going, you're going to have to sign over the transaction. These sorts of systems are going to need some sort of attachment to physical identities. And what makes those very different, too, in terms of establishing identity, is that proxying identity can be avoided. Like if somebody's proxying an identity used for ride sharing, when you get in the ride, they could have like a hash of their public identity or something like that that you could verify. Like, okay, this is the person that's actually attached to this identity, and then you could know it's not being proxied. And then when you post a review or a reputation rating, people would know it's actually for that person. But when it comes to package delivery, it's a little trickier. I mean, I guess you could have people put a hash of their identity maybe on the package or hide it within it. That might help. But ultimately, you don't want to rely on identity if you don't have to, and you also don't want to expose a lot of identity information if you don't have to. Like if you're just sending packages, maybe you don't want the ability for someone. Let's say one of the people that has these reputation scores for you gets compromised. You don't want that data to be used to show that you made all these purchases or sales, which any reputation system would sort of require. So yeah, I think reputation has a place, but I think it's a good policy to try to keep its use to a minimum where it isn't necessary.
Cool. So let's go back to the very beginning, and let's say that I'm a brand new user. Can you maybe give us a quick walkthrough of a transaction and settlement?
Sure. So you can browse within you download the client app, open it up, let it sync with the Bitmessage network. The posts would show up in an interface that lets you browse into a country. Say you're in the United States, and then into some categories and subcategories, and then you can view the listings for different sales there, or you can hit sort of a plus button on the top and add your own item to sell. If you saw something that you wanted to buy, you would just click a buy button, and it would tell you you need to deposit the funds that are required to set up the escrow. So you could transfer some Bitcoin to the Bitcoin wallet in the app, and then you could make a purchase request. So that gets sent through Bitmessage to the seller. The next time they open their client app, they'll receive that, and if they accept your bid, it will send back a message saying, hey, I've accepted this. Here's, this all kind of goes on under the hood. You don't see these messages directly. You just see an interface that sort of looks like Craigslist, but without any, email-like messages. Maybe like eBay, I guess. And it takes some inputs from the seller, and they send them over to you, Bitcoin unspent inputs, It sends them to the buyer, and under the hood on their side, they say, okay, the seller's ready to set up escrow. Are you down with that? If you okay it, it adds your inputs from your wallet. It signs those, sends them back. The seller's client then sees that. It signs them under the hood. It sends them to the blockchain, and then both clients see the confirmation on the blockchain. And then it requests from the buyer to send the address, the delivery address for the item. That gets sent to the seller. The seller sends the item, and then this goes through sort of in reverse for signing the transaction to release the payments and the deposits back to each party. And in the interface, there's sort of it sounds complicated, but in the interface, there's sort of a window that you can go to view your sale or your purchase that has little tabs on the top that walk you through making a bid, setting up the escrow, setting up the delivery, releasing the escrow.
That sounds fantastic. It sounds like you're gluing together three very interesting technologies that have developed very recently. So you've got Bitcoin, you've got Bitmessage, and you also have included Tor support. Is that correct?
That's right. All of our communications with the Bitmessage and Tor network, or Bitmessage and Bitcoin networks, happen over Tor.
So let me ask: do you, in the process of developing this, in the process of describing this to people, have you seen an overlap in those three communities? Which of them is the strongest? Where do you think people are most closely related within those communities, and where do you think that there should be more interaction?
Well, they all seem pretty disparate, and I don't know if I'm closely involved with any of them other than the Bitcoin community. But the Bitcoin community is definitely the strongest, and the one that seems very receptive to the project and what we're talking about. I think it would be great if they all knew more about each other. Hopefully this app will help make that happen a little bit. Bitmessage in particular, I think, is undervalued and underrecognized in the community. It's really very clever how it's done, and as far as I can tell, it seems like the most ready for consumer use of any of the solutions for peer-to-peer messaging that I've seen. It's not scalable to 30 billion messages a day that are being done with instant messages and SMS and things like that. But for these kinds of uses, it seems pretty perfect, and doesn't seem to be as well recognized as I think it should be.
So Steve, in addition to pulling from a number of the kind of the best projects we've seen in the crypto space, I guess in the past 20 years, you're also kind of working on a sort of a collective that's creating their own, which is voluntary.net. Can you tell us a little bit about that and about the other projects you're working on in addition to Bitmarkets, how they interface and what users can expect?
Sure. So Voluntary kind of got started sort of after Bitmarkets. Our initial idea was somebody should do this. Back a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now, when I saw NashX come out. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. They were kind of doing a three-party escrow, but it was based on mutual deposits from the buyer and the seller. And when I saw that, I was like, why does this need a third party? Everyone's incentives are aligned without it. And that was the genesis of Bitmarkets. And once we got rolling with that, we thought, well, we've got to make a Bitmessage framework to be a part of this app, so we might as well write a better Bitmessage UI just for sending messages, like an email type interface. And that became Bitpost. And once we had both Bitpost and Bitmarkets kind of in the works, we're like, well, maybe we should have sort of an umbrella organization to put these projects under. And that became Voluntary. The designer for all of these projects, Chris Robinson, had that domain and suggested that we use it, and he contributed that to the project. And then I brought in some other apps that I had from A4Crypt, which is sort of a drag and drop encryption app. And along the way, since we had to write a Tor framework, as part of this, wrote a little tour bar app which helps you run a tour relay in a really easy way. And yeah, we put those all under the voluntary domain. And I guess we were hoping that when people saw this kind of organization under which all these apps were being placed, that more people would kind of step up and say, oh, I've got an app that we like to associate with this, or would like to work with you guys to make a part of this project, or developers would come up and see it. You know, maybe they're not interested in working on one project, but maybe they're interested in working on another, and it would be a way that we could all kind of have build a community around building projects like this.
So very briefly, what was the inspiration for the name Voluntary and kind of the brand you built up? I mean, is it a sort of a philosophical thing, or is it cheap domain? Yeah. I'm assuming it's the first one. That's actually a terrible alternative. It's probably philosophical, right?
It is, yeah. It's philosophical, and we're all basically voluntarists. We'd like to see coercion minimized, and we all have different, somewhat different political ideas, but we're pretty much closely aligned with that general philosophy. And that was one of the things that really I was really excited about with Bitmarkets, is this potential to have marketplaces where coercion wasn't used to establish trust. Like in existing marketplaces, we have the court system, which is ultimately relies on people with weapons that come to deal with fraud. There are situations where that can be useful in establishing markets, but the idea that maybe there are alternatives for lots of uses, and this could be one of them, that a system where people can have punitive action happen without relying on any physical coercion. One based on every transaction that both parties have to agree to it voluntarily, and their punitive judgment will be handed out based on whether the two parties can agree on whether a fair exchange was made. That seemed I don't know, pretty amazing that Bitcoin could allow that to happen through smart contracts. We were really excited about that.
What you just said was fascinating, and about how it's a shared philosophy, and it's something on our show we've highlighted a bunch of projects in the past that share this philosophy, and everyone who creates them comes from different aspects of life and different attitudes, but really come together under this one ideal. With that said, are there any other projects right now that are really catching your eye, maybe outside of obviously what you're working on, anything that's really that you want to get out there and you want the public to just really check out?
That's a good question. There probably are, but they're not really coming to mind when I'm in a spot like this. I'm excited about the possibility of replacing all of our existing centralized services, especially our internet centralized services, with decentralized solutions. Most of the solutions, and I'm really encouraged by the fact that this, most people seem to get that and be excited about that too. But so far, most of the attempts to solve those problems seem to take federated versions instead of truly decentralized versions, even if they're calling themselves decentralized. Like Diaspora was an attempt. Some people called it like the decentralized Facebook, but really it was a federated Facebook. Still had servers, still had your private information was being shared, and it seems like a lot of the solutions either do that, or the other thing that I wish they would do differently is a lot of the systems will attempt to start their own altcoin. Like they'll have a decentralized market, but all the transactions have to take place in their own custom coin. I'm not against the idea of altcoins in general, but most of the ones I've seen tend to be about basically pocketing a lot of pre-mined coins, and that just doesn't seem like the right way to go about things from my perspective. So basically, any system that's out there, and maybe you guys know of some that doesn't do those two things, I'm all over. I'd like to see more stuff like that. Replace all the social networks, the email, all the things that are currently exposing all of our private communications and relationships, making those decentralized and private. Yeah, I'm all for that.
That's really exciting to hear, Steve. I think that it hits home to us as hosts and also our listeners. I have two final questions before we wrap. First and foremost, there's a lot of people like our listeners that want decentralized solutions or even maybe compromise and accept a federated solution. Are there parties out there that might be actively working against these types of movements, these types of technologies? And what can our listeners do to help out with what voluntary.net is doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure about who's working against it. I mean, there's definitely the people that have something to lose, maybe are governments and corporations that currently extract a lot of power from the way that things exist right now. I guess the biggest barrier seems to be like a mental shift. Like, I'm not sure, like there's sort of a minority of maybe more technically oriented people that sort of get that this is a big problem, right? That privacy is a major problem. Like, most people when they use social networking don't think about, if I was using this since I was a little kid, basically every message I've ever communicated to anyone, and that, nowadays most of what we even say to other people might be through electronic communications, would be recorded over my whole life. Like, I don't think that people really think that, about how significant that is. But I think eventually they're going to realize it. Eventually, like, things like this, what was it recently, this website about affairs was hacked, and, how many affairs occur on Facebook, or could be exposed by Facebook. How many potential politicians in the future are basically going to be exposed to, organizations, maybe even within the government, saying, it sure would be a shame if this information got out, if you don't vote for more funding for our section of the government, or whatever it is. And that maybe that sounds conspiratorial, but Watergate and all of these other things suggest that these things really do happen. I think after enough events happen, people will start to get it, mainstream will start to get it. This is really important and is a real threat to our culture and civil society. But until then, I guess it's our responsibility to kind of spread the word and get people excited about it and do what we can to get the ball rolling. And I feel like that's all voluntary is trying to do, and I guess what you guys are trying to do. This is going to be a big effort, and we just kind of want to get it started. And I'm really happy if other people were working on projects like this, and I didn't have to. I just want to see them done and out there for people to use. So yeah, if they kind of feel the same way and they'd like to help out, I'd love to see their projects, or if they want to help us out with our projects, that would be great. The biggest thing for Bitmarkets right now is kind of getting this chicken and egg problem solved of buyers want sellers and sellers want buyers. So if they can post sales or check out for sales as users, that would really help Bitmarkets get going.
Okay, Steve, very inspirational words for all of us. And if people want to help spread the word and get more traffic, where can people find you, and where can people find Voluntary? What are those URLs that we can share?
Yeah, so bitmarkets.org will redirect to Voluntary, or if you want to go straight to Voluntary, it's voluntary.net, and you can find all of our projects there. I'm on Twitter at Steve Dekorte, Dekorte, and yeah, that should do it.
All right, Steve, it has been a fantastic interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Persistent services, servers running, and yeah, it's basically to give people no fees, no middleman marketplace option.
So why was this feature important to you? I guess sort of why did you focus on the anonymity, and what ultimately motivated you to create Bitmarkets as it is?
Well, basically it was a political motivation and kind of a discomfort with the way that things were headed privacy-wise. It seems like at this point, like there are people that have been born not too long ago for which every economic transaction they engage in is being recorded in a way that, you know, could be shared or inspected or sold to advertisers or the highest bidder. That just didn't seem like an ideal future. And this was on, or Craigslist or eBay. Why can't people just connect to each other? The big barrier has been sort of a decentralized messaging system, and we're slowly piecing together the parts to solve that problem. We're using Bitmessage to solve that problem. It's not ideal, but it's good enough for the scale that we need to do Craigslist and eBay-like uses.
So you mentioned kind of seeing a trend of decentralization and seeing like this as being kind of an inevitable culmination of a number of forces. Can you tell us a little bit about like how long have you been in tech, and what makes you see kind of in the course of your career, what makes you see this as being the right time for decentralized marketplaces?
So I guess I've been professionally in tech since the 90s.
Joining us today is Steve Dekorte, who is the lead developer of voluntary.net, the creator and purveyor of Bitmarkets, and the author of the I/O programming language. Thank you for joining us today, Steve.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, so voluntary.net has a number of projects under your umbrella. Let's start with Bitmarkets, though. It seems to be the one that's very interesting to a lot of people right now. Can you tell us what exactly Bitmarkets is?
Yeah, so Bitmarkets is an anonymous, decentralized marketplace based on the Bitcoin currency as the means of exchange. It's private. It uses Tor to protect the location of buyer and seller. It's built on top of Bitmessage, so messages are relayed without having to stay online, or as part of our way of giving people an option to that, potentially allowing them to do private exchanges and not have all that information exposed.
So with that said, what have been some of the most interesting use cases, or I should be a little more specific and say buyer-seller dynamics you've noticed developed on the platform?
Well, it's pretty new, and we don't really have much uptake yet. There's only been maybe a handful of users since we released it last November. And yeah, we're just a bunch of developers, 3 developers and 1 designer, and we put it together and released it, and got a little bit of good press, and didn't really think about marketing. We assumed that would have some, take off on its own, and we're kind of finding that's not the way things work. So that's part of the reason I'm here, and kind of doing a tour of different Bitcoin meetups and talking about it. Yeah, I'm not really sure yet what the early users will be like or what they'll look like. We're interested to find out.
Well, let me ask you this, Steve. What do you hope that they look like?
Well, eventually, I think it's inevitable that all marketplaces are going to be decentralized, potentially anonymous, no fees, no middlemen. With the internet, there's just no reason to have centralized middlemen anymore. We can connect without them. It's kind of like Visa and MasterCard clearly aren't going to be needed when we have the internet and Bitcoin and those sorts of things. Why do we need Amazon